Public forest land as carbon wasteland, proposed U.S. Forest Service rules on carbon capture disposal. And this is going to tie together a lot of things that people have asked about or talked about. Steve's question about what's going to happen in Minnesota, lots of other issues all the way from the beginning of our day. And I'll try to remember all those things as I'm talking. And I'm going to use a laser pointer. So there's this lovely sign outside the Superior National Forest. It's your choice, this or this. And if you can't see, it's healthy living trees and dead trees. And that's sort of the theme of the presentation. So I'm going to cover three topics and talk fast. Like I said, what is the Forest Service proposing to do, implications in Minnesota, and larger context and concerns. As we all already know, the Forest Service is a federal agency that manages our national forests, and we are blessed to have I don't even, that's the middle of my presentation. I am going to start with what they actually are going to do, but they are a federal agency and they manage lands on behalf of you, the taxpayers, the public. You don't have to read all of this, but this is what the Forest Service has said they were going to do. They said it in the middle of June of this year, and they said that they were going to make a fundamental change to their permits. And for the first time ever, they are going to allow permanent permits for use of Forest Service lands. They have never done this, not once. And specifically, my yellow highlight there is permanent carbon dioxide sequestration on National Forest Service lands. So they not only are going to change the conditional use permit system, they're going to also try to make it only accessible to carbon dioxide sequestration companies. This is a huge about face, a 180 from a federal agency that has always refused to do so. And that shows the seriousness and the I guess, commitment of the Biden administration to getting its federal agencies to lock in carbon capture as a technology that they are supportive of. This is the exact language that they are proposing to amend, and I've highlighted it in red. Currently, if you apply for a conditional use permit to use a national forest and you say you're going to use it, you want an exclusive or perpetual right to use the national forest, the Forest Service says, no, we will never let you do that. It's an absolute bar, and that's what they're proposing, that they will any day now issue draft rules that would propose to change that. And when I say that they've never allowed this, it has come up before. The last time they updated this permit was in 1998. And utility companies asked them, they said, we want an exclusive and perpetual right to use national forests. We are utility companies. We have the public's interest in mind. We need to maintain roads. We need to get to our power lines. We need this, and society needs this. And the Forest Service, in another giant paragraph that you won't have to read, I swear, said, absolutely not. We will never let you do this. It has been our longstanding policy that you cannot take a public good, a public land, and privatize it with a permit that locks out anyone else from using it. Specifically, I have highlighted in yellow a chunk of this giant paragraph, and now I've blown it up gigantic for you. To grant such use would, in effect, grant fee title, so ownership, to federal land to an authorization holder. Longstanding congressional and executive branch policy dictates that authorizations to use National Forest Service lands cannot grant a permit holder an exclusive or perpetual right of occupancy in lands owned by the public. But that is what they have proposed to do in rulemaking that'll come out any day now. I actually expected it on Friday, but here we are, hasn't come out yet. And this is, when they say that it is a president or an executive and congressional policy to not allow this, they were right in 1998. There are many laws that govern the Forest Service. There's their Organic Act, which establishes the Forest Service, the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, and the National Forest Management Act. All of these require the Forest Service to manage the renewable resources on the lands for sustainable yield. So obviously there's something to be said about cutting down trees isn't always good for that individual tree, but they are managing those forests for sustainable yield and not utterly destroying them. Even an example that has come up in articles, people say, oh, well, they allow mining in national forests, so this is just mining, right? Well, no, even under our mining laws, ask the good people of Polymet, You cannot build an open pit mine on national forest lands. You have to buy the land from the Forest Service and give them an equivalent amount of land. So all of the existing laws say you cannot permanently occupy these lands. You cannot exclusively own a public good. And the Forest Service's duty is to manage renewable resources for the betterment of those lands and also for the income of the companies that they're trying to benefit, but specifically companies that have to share. And in the case of this proposed rulemaking, they would stop that entirely. So that's what they're proposing to do. Ominous. The implications in Minnesota are my next topic. So Minnesota, this is what I almost jumped to at the beginning. Minnesota has 2 national forests. If you don't live up north like me, you might not know a whole lot about them, but we have the Superior National Forest, which inside of it has the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. And we have the Chippewa National Forest, which inside of it, or mostly inside of it, is the Leech Lake Reservation. Here's a lovely map, and you'll see the Superior National Forest, quite big right there with the boundary waters in it. And there's the Chippewa National Forest. Both of them very impressive national forests. I'm not trying to say the Chippewa, it's not as big, but very, very nice national forest. And this map simplifies it a bit because I believe there's some checkerboard here where it's actually both reservation and Chippewa National Forest intermingled with each other. So we are, not a Western state by any means, but we have massive national forests here in Minnesota. And we also have unique geology. So the interesting thing about Minnesota, we have a significant amount of basalt rocks, which is also mafic rock at the surface, which many states don't have that type of rock at all, but also don't have it at the surface if they do have it. We also have a small amount of ultramafic rock at the surface. And we also have the only large iron mines in the country. So I'm so happy that Dr. Gruber brought up the iron making process, the steel making process, she said specifically in Indiana. Well, that process starts here in Minnesota at mines right next to the national forest. What is mafic rock and ultramafic rock? Well, if you look at Hawaii, the whole thing is mafic rock. So it's a volcanic type of rock that's bubbling up out of the ocean and is a basalt, as far as I know. I'm much like my colleague Sarah. I'm not a scientist. I'm a lawyer, but I'm trying to explain it. And then an ultramafic rock, also a volcanic rock. It's these orange dots here on our friend Alaska that are not as big, not as prevalent as the green parts. But these are the types of rocks that when you're not talking about injecting into saline aquifers, but instead you're talking about weathering, as Dr. Grubert said, weathering rocks, that's the type of carbon sequestration you would be doing with these types of rocks. So Hawaii, pretty easy to find the right kind of rock. Alaska, not impossible. But you go into the lower 48 states, and you'll see there's quite a lot right here on the West Coast around the Ring of Fire. There's a little bit down in New Mexico and Arizona. And then there's a nice big green patch right here in upper Minnesota, a little bit in the UP and Wisconsin. So these are the saline. It's much harder to see on this one, but this is a USGS map. And those are all the saline aquifers and oil patches that other maps have shown. And yes, that's what we've been talking about. That's why you would want pipelines. But if you're talking about actual sequestration that's going to happen in Minnesota, it's going to happen in these rocks, and it's going to happen using a different type of technology. It's not going to be compressed supercritical CO2. It's going to be CO2 that's been combined with water to create carbonic acid intentionally. So you have acidic water, you're shooting it underground, and you're hoping like hell that it binds to that rock in a weathering process. Again, not a geologist. So the difference here between this slide and the next slide is this little X I put on it. So this is obviously overlapping with the Superior National Forest. This is overlapping with our other lovely national forest. And this is a little patch of ultramafic rock, which is in neither of those public lands. But the reason we're taking a quick trip there is because it is a place where they're doing research at the proposed Talon metal mine. So there is ongoing research that has, I think, already started at the Talon Metal Mine site, which is not a mine that exists yet, but it is in theory going to be a mine that would mine nickel in Aiken County. And as a fun side project, they've received $2.2 million from the Department of Energy to figure out if they could also do carbon capture using the ultramafic rock where they are. So the difference between orange and green is ultra and super. Again, not a geologist, but ultra would be easier to do carbon capture with and weathering on. So they're doing the research now to figure out if it's even possible in Minnesota geological deposits. The company, I think, as Dr. Fisher said, 2.2 million is chump change of your taxpayer dollars. The company is putting in another $4 million. But if this actually was developed, we would be talking about billions and billions of dollars under the the Reduction Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. There you go, the IRA. Currently, the research should take 3 years, and it includes lab studies and field work. And I would also like to thank very much Mr. Tom Anderson at Tamarack Water Alliance, who helped me to find all these facts and also developing a similar presentation himself. Oh, so Talon Metal, being a sulfide mine or rare earth metals mine, is just one of many potential industrial sites on the edge of the forest with an interest in CCS profits. So it's starting with a mining company, and I am focused on mining companies, but it wouldn't necessarily end there. And so going back to that USGS report that overlaps both the relevant geology along with huge sources of CO2 emissions, I think a lot of people in this room can tell me what that big yellow dot is, but I'll tell you it's Boswell Energy Center, a giant coal plant. Same thing with this big yellow dot, that's Sherco, a big coal-fired power plant. But does anybody know what this cluster of orange dots is? Yell it out if you know. That's all our iron mines, and there's one right here because that's where the ore from Babbitt goes on the train. So all our iron mines are clustered right here, right around here. Here we have, whoa, hit the wrong button by a lot. Sorry. So down in the cluster around Duluth, there are more paper companies and waste management facilities. And all of these are producing up to 2.5 million tons of carbon emissions, according to this map. So they are not all on the same level, but they are all pretty big sources of carbon emissions. And just to illustrate why I'm focused on the smaller dots and not the bigger dots, this is just a list of 2022 emissions. This is the top 11 CO2 emission sources in the state right now. The ones in blue are power plants. Sherco and Boswell both have retirement deadlines already. Flint Hills and St. Paul Park are refineries, which, in a decarbonized world, those also would be closing down. But among them, you have Mintac. The 5th biggest source of CO2 emissions in the state is an iron mine. The 11th is an iron mine. The 17th is an iron mine. The 19th is an iron mine. The Minorca mine is on the list too. And I don't want to just make it about iron mines, but there are paper and timber plants that are in the general area. We've heard a lot about the ethanol plants. They are not, thankfully, right next to the forest yet, but you never know. And then there's a bunch of waste management. And this goes back to Patrick's point this morning. A lot of the problem we're in is about over-consuming things we don't need. We wouldn't have unbelievable amounts of CO2 emissions coming from waste management if we weren't consuming so much stuff and producing so much waste. So there's a lot of feedback loops built into this. There's a lot of unforced errors. But I do live in a world where I know that iron mines are not necessarily going to cease to exist the way that I would hope some garbage burners do. Oh, I am now skipping way ahead. Let's see if we can get this back under control. These are, you guys haven't even seen these slides yet. Okay. So this was just me trying to return to this map for a second to again show you where they're all positioned near the geological deposits, and just sort of point out that these plants are not going to close down the way that Boswell or Sherco eventually will, right? We are going to continue producing iron in Minnesota because we are the only source of iron in the United States of America, and that industry is in a good, has a good deal with the politicians of Minnesota, shall we say. They're not going out of business tomorrow. So just some reminders from what I just said. There's only a small amount of research remaining for Talon Metals before they can come out and say they're going to be getting on the CCS bandwagon and have access to at least the venture capital we've heard about, BlackRock and things like that, saying that they are going to eventually make their $4 billion, their $10 billion. The Superior National Forest and the particular geology that we're talking about is ringed by major industrial sources of carbon pollution, and I would say sources that we will not be seeing closed down the way we would a coal plant necessarily. And the proposal from the Forest Service is to erase protections from permanent permits to allow the private profit from public lands. So this would be opening up, not just in Minnesota, obviously, but opening up a future war between environmentalists and people who live there and indigenous communities, and anyone who wants to make $4 billion off of potentially a crazy scheme to make a bunch of carbon credits out of mineralizing a small amount of carbon into our lovely rocks. So I'll zoom out now from Minnesota and talk about the larger context and concerns, because there are many, many concerns. What could possibly go wrong? So many things. And again, I will remind you all that Tom Anderson at Tamarack Water Alliance is working on another presentation on this topic, and it's tomorrow at 10 a.m. So jump on their website and sign up for that webinar, and you can hear more from Tom about this. But so many things can happen when you are creating untold amounts of carbonic acid and injecting it into the ground. You probably could have guessed. We've learned from Oklahoma, you can cause an earthquake when you shoot a huge amount of water into geology that wasn't actually ready for it. You can create carbonic acid, because that's literally what you're trying to do. It can mix with the water that is there. And as I've learned from my friend Becky Rahm at Save the Boundary Waters, we don't really want a bunch of acid going into our water table up in northern Minnesota, because it's also well connected. She's mostly thinking about sulfuric acid, but I don't think carbonic acid is a heck of a lot better. And there's the possibility of the permanent destruction of public lands that are held in perpetuity for the purpose of creating renewable resources and sustainable yield. So, I mean, you know, you inject a bunch of carbonic acid under a tree. I don't think that tree is going to have a nice time trying to deal with that change in their habitat, nor are animals going to be able to drink acid water, nor am I, as someone who lives right there, going to be able to consume the water myself. And to zoom out a little bit from those just short reports on or thoughts on impacts, I'll bring your attention again to the Leech Lake Reservation, which is surrounded by a national forest. And there is a significant amount of this type of geology in, I believe, the north part of that national forest. What are they going to get out of this deal when they start issuing permits for carbon capture around their reservation? And if you're just focused on the reservations, you're missing the point that all of northern Minnesota, so these are the reservations in pink, but all of northern Minnesota, and I would argue all of the state of Minnesota itself, is covered by treaty rights. So the 1837 treaty reserves the right to gather and even to wild rice by name. That's where Talon is, I believe. 1854 treaty covers all of the Superior National Forest. The 1855 covers the Chippewa National Forest. So all of these are treaty lands, and yet you have the Department of Energy granting money to a private company to research things to do to the land without actually asking the tribes that have treaty rights about whether they should be granting them money or doing that. And this wonderful thing happened in May. The Superior National Forest specifically has entered into a memorandum of understanding with 3 tribes and the 1854 Treaty Authority, saying that they will now consult with those tribes and the Treaty Authority, government to government, about managing these resources. This is a great step in the right direction, but not a huge step in the right direction. You know, I mean, we have for such a long time not given the tribes their due, and a federal agency is finally in a permanent, real agreement to do government to government consultation. But as soon as they give them that, or as soon as that has been agreed to, we have the potential for the destruction of the resources that they are going to co-manage, right? I mean, if you allow the geology to be so degraded, or the water table and the geology to be so changed that the reserved rights to hunt and gather and manage resources is no longer valuable, then you're not really giving them very much by allowing them to help you manage a wasteland. This change could imperil the living resources that the agency has finally started to acknowledge need to be co-managed with the tribes. So it's a very strange thing to on one hand say we're going to acknowledge your legal rights to these lands, and at the same time we're going to make sure that we ruin them before you actually get your hands on them. So this is just a summary of what we've already said. There's so many things that could go wrong: earthquakes, acidified water, destroyed public land and habitats, desecrated treaty rights. And then another big one that I would add to it is just a waste of time. And what I mean by that is that if anybody here is familiar with the iron mines that we have in our state, they don't really do things on a human timeline. Some of these companies have a long history of wasting time in order to save money and wear down the agencies that regulate them and the people that would see them not pollute. So US Steel's Mintac had the oldest water pollution permit in the state in 2016 when I sued the Pollution Control Agency, and it still doesn't have an updated water permit. The current timeline is they might have a current water permit next summer. So that's 7.5 years. And these permits only last 5 years. So that's just to show you that US Steel is very good at making sure it doesn't get regulated. For decades, it has delayed action by the agency by constantly offering new studies and new proposals for ways they'll do it a little bit differently, and then always pushing the timeline down the road. That's in the water context. But in the carbon capture context, US Steel has recently announced that they have a plan to capture carbon at one of those plants that Dr. Grubert was talking about, this one in Pennsylvania. But your taxpayer dollars and mine are going to go to a study funded by the National Energy Technology Laboratory to see if at one of those steel mills, US Steel can scrape off a little bit of the carbon that's coming off of the very, very old steelmaking plant that hasn't been updated in any meaningful way for decades. But they are going to start a study, and they plan to start it in 2025. The test will take 6 months. And they will, at the end of that time, I'm sure, have a couple of years where they need to study how well the technology worked, maybe think of new ways to work on it. We've seen this in the water quality context. They're very good at studying things. They're very good at taking some public money to do so. But all of this is just a way where it's now 2030 and we still have an old technology steel mill in Pennsylvania that should have been closed 20 years ago. So what I would like to know is, will this research and development just be another way for the iron and steel industry to continuously kick the can down the road when there's already technology, and Dr. Gruber alluded to this, already technology to just make steel without making so much carbon pollution? There's actual low pollution, probably not zero pollution technologies that are being used in Sweden right now. And yet here in Minnesota and in the US, we're wasting millions of taxpayer dollars on potentially maybe capturing some carbon later, when you could just redo the steelmaking process with the technology that doesn't create the pollution in the first place. Only time will tell is not an acceptable answer when there's so little time left. I just don't understand why we continue to throw money after these things when there's already a mitigative technology that isn't carbon capture. And I'm sorry that I'm going so long, but I just wanted to show you some vacation photos I took in 2017 when I started my research for this proposal. This is in Iceland. And this is what I liked to call the Terror Dome before I realized it was a CCS facility. This is just off the highway in Iceland. And it's a nice little geodesic dome and on a drill pad surrounded by gravel. And I have a video here, which I hope is going to work. Oh, the sound works. Okay. Okay, so what can people see in this video? Can you tell me what that is? It's sort of blurry. Giant power line. Okay, you saw the Terror Dome, I assume. That's my nickname for it. They don't call it a Terror Dome at the carbon capture company. What did you hear coming out of the dome constantly? Loud steam, a screaming steam element to it. I wasn't there long enough to know if it was 24 hours a day, but it didn't stop while I was around. What don't you see along the hills here? And keep in mind, I'm talking about the Forest Service. Yeah, really plants of any kind. And just to illustrate this a little bit more, this is where this industry is successfully doing carbon capture on new volcanic rock. And this is just over the hill from that last video. And this is not pollution. This is volcanic activity. It's not actually coming from the injection site. I don't want to disparage anyone, but like these are not conditions we have in Minnesota. This is not a place that's very much like the North Woods. So I mean, when you're talking about putting in these nifty whiz bang technologies, I mean, it's certainly an interesting project, and it's certainly interesting that someone in Iceland is doing it. Maybe it would be a good thing to do in Hawaii. I have my questions about plopping down something like that in the middle of the Superior National Forest and being able to tell the 3 tribes with treaty rights to that land that they're not going to see all of their resources destroyed. You know, like wolves, bears, and eagles are not going to want to hang out around this sort of industrialization. And we're not going to be able to have both of those things at the same time in a national forest. So there is public opposition growing to this, even though the official proposal from the Forest Service hasn't come out yet as of today. There is an online poll or a petition rather, and somebody else made these graphics. I certainly have not used the Forest Service logo without permission. That was somebody else. I just put it in my presentation. And over 20,000 people have already told the Forest Service to just not drop this rule, not even start, just give up now. The Forest Service has delayed the production of this rule. It had been scheduled for August, and like I said, I expected it last week. I was going to talk about that in my presentation, but then they didn't put it out. And then on the other side of this, on Thursday of this week at 9 a.m. local time, Joe Manchin is going to be having a nice big full committee hearing about examining the opportunities and challenges of deploying carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration and direct air capture technologies on federal and non-federal lands. So on one end, you have the people who say, why would you do this? This is not a good idea. This is the last thing we want. And then on the other end, you have federal agencies, state agencies, and companies that are just aligned right now and all in for doing this on federal lands, on non-federal lands, wherever they can get it approved, wherever they can get it permitted. Interestingly, at that hearing on Thursday, no one from the Forest Service or any federal agency that manages federal lands is going to be there. It's going to be the EPA, the Department of Energy. So not the people you would think they would have invited. And I like to think that's because the Forest Service might have cold feet. I don't know. They haven't told me they do.